Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigus.
Welcome back to the Fly Culture Podcast. My guest today is a well-travelled fly angler and writer, Adrian Latimer. We'll be talking about trout, salmon and his new book, Sketches with a Fly Rod. Adrian, it's good to have you here. How are you doing?
Great, thank you, and big thanks for welcoming me on the podcast.
You're most welcome, and there's so much that we can talk about on here. It's lovely to be able to speak to you because obviously you've also contributed to Fly Culture, and I feel like I know everyone vicariously through emails and things, and it's really, really nice to actually be able to talk to you at last as well.
No, it is. It's really nice to see you, and I'm sorry you can't see me, but that's my technical prowess gone wrong.
Not a problem in the slightest. Now, for our listeners, can you tell us a little bit about where you're based and where you're speaking to us from today?
Yeah, I'm actually based about 20 miles west of Paris, so I'm actually near Versailles. If I stood on the roof and was quite tall, I could probably just about see the chateau, the castle in the distance. So I've lived in France. Work brought me here in 1991, so I've been here 31 years.
And what does that mean from a fishing perspective for you, Adrian?
I mean, to be honest, not a lot. I think it would be maybe a bit cruel, but it'd be fair to say that, the French, there's some fantastic French fly fishermen and fly ties, but I think if I was going to make a gratuitous generalization, the French often think a trout or whatever is best served on a plate. So, there's not a lot to be done. I'm an hour and a half drive from Normandy. Normandy has the same chalk belt as the UK. It goes under the channel and comes up in Normandy. So actually, technically, there are chalk streams over here. The agriculture is different. The attitudes are different. It's very difficult to get farmers to all agree to do something. So basically, the fishing, I'm sure there's some private stretches that are nice, but the fishing is really not particularly exciting. The salmon are mainly gone, sadly, a bit like everywhere else, but they've really gone here. So I have fished a little bit in Brittany. I spent a day for salmon once. I've fished the odd trout in Normandy. I tried to fish once in the Pyrenees, but there's only a limited amount of time you can go fishing. So I tend to prefer to go somewhere where I know there'll be hopefully a few more fish. So yeah, I don't really fish here at all nowadays.
So does that mean, what would you consider your sort of home water then? Because I know you travel obviously back to the UK. Would that be where the heart of your fishing really lies?
Yeah, I guess. I think, my dad lives alone in London, so I go there whenever I can. So the chalk streams in Hampshire, etc., Wiltshire are within easy striking distance. So I guess that would be quote unquote home water just because it's close. I like to fish in Argentina. I'm sure we'll discuss later. I like to fish in Iceland. I've been to those two countries for, 25 years or something. So I go a lot there, and I love Scotland. I fish less and less in Scotland because salmon fishing's getting complicated, to put it politely. And for me to go across from here and get up to Scotland, there's a cost and an effort involved. And frankly, if you're going to spend a week and catch nothing, it's nice to see friends and the scenery is beautiful, but it's a bit pointless. So I think the home water would probably be somewhere in the middle of Hampshire.
And which stream in particular? I've sort of rekindled my love of chalkstream fishing and have been zooming up and down the A303 from Devon and doing some fishing. And I'm going in a week or two's time as well to have a couple of days up there. Which would you consider your favourite?
Well, I guess there's two places I would most like to be. One's the Upper Itchen, and the other would be the Bourne rivulet, which I think is the top tributary of the Test. And there are a number of reasons. I mean, I think partly because they capture so much history, both literary and fishing history, the whole area. Skews effectively put nymph fishing on the map on the Upper Itchen, Upper in Abbas, and I guess he was at school just down the road. So he learnt a lot of his fly fishing on the Upper Itchen, which is where I still think most of the trout caught are probably caught on a nymph, and a lot of it goes back to him. The Bourne Rivulet was where Harry Plunkett Green wrote his beautiful book, Where the Bright Waters Meet, which I love to read. So I guess those are the two places I'd most like to be. They're very pretty, they're unspoilt, and these days they tend to still have wild brown trout and grayling. By the way, the other favourite place I have, you mentioning driving up the 303, is Devon, because that's where I actually learnt to fish anyway. But that's a bit further down the road, unfortunately.
Yeah, we'll come on to that shortly as well. But it's interesting to me that you mentioned the Bourne Rivulet, and I fished it, been very lucky to fish it a couple of times. And that's I've fished the sort of section by the church where people leave flies on Plunkett Green's grave. And then just a tiny bit upstream from there, the next beat up, I think. And that was fascinating fishing. And sometimes people talk about chalk streams and stocked fish and easy to catch, etc., etc. That, to me, was one of the most absorbing, challenging and interesting days fishing that I'd had there. And I don't know if you'd concur with that, because it's not sort of easy to fish at all, is it, by any means?
No, it's not. It's funny because I was trying to book some fishing on the Bourne next year, and I was trying to get a few days during the Mayfly, frankly, because, as you say, it's easier. And I was talking to a friend of mine, so I invited him, and he actually said, look, I'm sorry, and this is a good fisherman. He said, the Bourne's, I think, beyond my pay grade. It's too difficult. And I said, well, I honestly don't think it is. I think you've just been unlucky. But the thing about the Bourne is, as you know, it's very small, it's gin clear, and the bottom is perfect white chalk. So, and the trout are quite big. So when you see a trout, it sticks out like a battleship in the middle of a lake. You can't miss it. The flip side of that is the trout can't really miss you. The river's, 5-10 yards wide at most. You probably either have to go along the bank, in which case you stick up like a sort of enormous heron, or you wade. Even when you're behind a fish, I found on the Bourne, it took me years to work it out, but if the fish aren't feeding and there isn't some kind of fly life, frankly, you're better to sit on the bank and watch. And that, especially when I was young, I just could not do. Sit there and then I'd say, oh God, I've got to fish. So I'd go out there and I'd eventually see a fish, and I'd sneak out and I'd have my rod parallel to the water, and I'd unhook the fly. I'd lift the rod to the vertical, probably still had the fly in my hand, and poof, there'd be a puff of silt, and the fish is gone. You go, whoa, I'm 10 yards behind you. You don't have, a rear turret. You don't have somebody facing me. How on earth do you know I'm here? I haven't even thrown the fly. So it is challenging. If the flies begin to come, you'll see the fish move out onto station. They'll come out from under the bank, and suddenly you'll be standing there, and a 2 or even 3 pound wild brown trout will literally swim out straight in front of you and stop. Sometimes too close to you, and I'm trying to go backwards and pretend I don't exist because there's a fish literally under my rod top. And sometimes, if you get it right, you plonk a nymph or a dry fly on. And sometimes if I'm nymph fishing, and frankly I do it badly, and I cast a nymph and I think, oh God, that was an awful cast, and it lands with a plop somewhere almost behind the fish, and you think, oh, idiot. Fish hears the plop, turns round, suddenly see this big white mouth opening and it coming towards you, and then generally I pull the fly straight out of its mouth. But occasionally I actually set the hook. And sometimes you'll get a fish, and I'll spend 30 minutes, 45 minutes and go through a fly box. And you'll see it looking, it's quite fun. You'll see, okay, he didn't even look at that, he ignored it completely, didn't think it was food. This one, you just see the head twist, or it just moves over. Sometimes they come up, nose underneath it, and even drift downstream, nose right underneath it, and then say, nah, no thanks, go back down. So I think, the idea, to me, that's why I love it, because it's it gets the adrenaline going, and just sufficiently enough, it's humiliating. Not often, because that would ruin it. So you can catch fish, but every now and then you actually can't. There are quite every season there'll be a fish or two, and you think, I cannot get this fish to rise. It's looked at, half a dozen flies. I stood here for an hour. I could go through the rest of the fly box, and eventually the hatch will stop, and the fish will just say, "Thanks very much. I'm going back under the bank." And you think, take my hat off to you, you win. And that's, to me, the whole point of it.
Yeah, that sums it up absolutely perfectly. And this is going to segue beautifully, but the fishing on the Bourne particularly, and you talked about the puff of silt as the fish disappears when you're away. The difference there for me, and it may be size of the stream, I don't know, but to me it was more reminiscent of Devon fishing, in the sense of often when I fish some of the bigger stretches of chalk stream, that the fish will go away, but they don't go far and they come back again relatively quickly. Whereas at home, if I'm fishing a stream and I've blown a fish, I know I'm probably, if it's a good fish, there's a good chance I won't get another go of that today or on that day. And I found that stream very similar in that sense. When the fish were gone, they weren't sort of milling round back again. There were obviously a couple of cases where that may have proved me wrong, but generally I found that the fish didn't come back on station relatively quickly. Had you experienced that?
I think you're absolutely right, Pete. If you, as I said, it's very easy to spot the fish. The lies are obvious. When you spook one, she goes straight under the bank and hides. And because it's a small stream, as you say, if I see a big one and I've messed it up, I'll go back a couple of hours later, and then I'll go back a couple of hours later. And the trouble is, you think, okay, he's going to be there. Fish is going to be there. And generally, fish is not there. There's one occasion I remember when I did go back 3 times and I caught the fish on the third effort. But usually you go back, they're not there. And it's really annoying because you think, I've blown it once, but I'm going to do better this time. I know what this fish is going to take. I've sussed it out. And the fish is just, no, you've had your chance. I'm staying under the bank in case you come back.
And that's why we come back for more, isn't it?
Now, that's exactly why you keep coming back for more. You don't want it to be too easy, do you?
No, absolutely. Now, as I said, it was a perfect segue because we're going to look at your fishing timeline, and we've talked about the A303 and we've talked about Devon. Where did fishing begin for you?
It was in Devon, Pete, as you said. Nobody in my family, close family, fished. But I had a great uncle who originally, I think they had a farm down just off Dartmoor. And there was a river that went through it, and he loved to fish. So he had the fishing with the farm. They eventually got rid of the farm, but they kept fishing. And I guess it was in the mid-70s. I think it was an uncle of mine was getting married in Exeter. So my parents said, let's go down to Exeter, and, we'll go and stay with your uncle, your great uncle. And they said, by the way, you can bring the fishing rod that's in your cupboard. And, I was maybe just about a young teenager. And for some reason that nobody remembers, I'd spent all my pocket money buying a fishing rod, a couple of floats, and a book. I don't know why. Somebody at school some elder kid at school must have been very cool and liked fishing. And I thought, wow, this is what I need to do. So I spent all my fishing rod, all my pocket money, and bought the stuff. No clue what to do with it. It sat in the cupboard for years. So when my parents said, we're going to Devon, your uncle fishes, bring the fishing rod, I kind of looked grumpy and said, oh, yeah, stupid fishing rod. Anyway, I took it. And my uncle was a colonel, a retired colonel in the army, and he was the sort of classic, gruff, everybody was scared of him. I don't think he liked kids. So I turned up, and he probably thought, oh, God, some bloody teenager. What on earth am I going to do with this? So my parents must have said, look, he's got this fishing rod. It's been sitting in a cupboard for 10 years. For goodness sake, could you do something? So he could do that. So he said, okay, come with me. Took me on the lawn, put on a little red and black spotted Metz spinner. I still have it. And he said, try this. So I chucked it a couple of times on the lawn. And for some reason, I thought, well, this is quite fun. Then he said, well, let's just go down the bottom of the garden, cross the road, and there's the river. And he said, chuck it in there. And I didn't catch anything, but, fishing obviously hooked to me big time. because that was it really, and it was very odd. As I said, nobody in the close family fished, but so I then go down. I would then go down on holiday and see him and fish a bit, and then I did eventually use the fishing rod in the cupboard, and I'd go and get little bleak in a gravel pit, and then I'd go to the Thames and try and catch gudgeon. And then as I got a bit older, there's a few ponds near us, and I'd catch the old crucian carp. And eventually I got some tench, which were much more exciting. And then I'd try and catch a pike and a real carp. And so it went on. And all through that period, every summer, I'd go down for a week down to Devon. And eventually I got a fly rod. I mean, my uncle lent me a fly rod, and then he sort of taught me, I guess, how to fly cast. And that was it, really. He's cost me a lot of money.
So, Adrian, do you remember that first fish?
Yes, I do. And it was probably, oh, heavens. It was in the mid-70s, so it was a very long time ago. And it was a tiny sea trout. It was at night because, obviously that's when you fish, and the sea trout. And it created all around the pool. It went upstream, it went behind me. I had to turn around. It was pitch black. I had no clue what was going on. And it's so long ago, and I can still remember it. And, I think that's pretty impressive that a tiny fish can excite you so much, give you so much emotion that half a century later you can still remember it.
And does that mean you still make trips down to Devon to fish to remember those moments?
I sadly don't. My great uncle, he died quite a long time ago, and then eventually my great aunt did. So I don't fish there anymore. It's permanently on my radar screen, let's put it that way, and I'm sure that one day I will. But if ever we move back to the UK, then yes, I definitely will. But at the moment, no, I haven't fished there for a few years. But I will do. I every time I drive past it, I have a brother-in-law who lives in Devon, so when I drive past it, I always make a detour, and my poor, long-suffering wife just stares at me. We park the car, and I walk through a field and stand next to a river, and then I walk back to the car and go and see the brother-in-law.
That sounds absolutely perfect, and perfectly natural behaviour as well. Myself, and I'm sure many of the people listening, I always, when I'm driving along a river, I have to have a glance at it. I always hope secretly that I'm going to see somebody walking down the field towards the river with a fishing rod, which I have done on a number of occasions, and have nearly had some close shaves on the road, I shouldn't admit to, but where I've been busily watching the road. And that's something, like you say, the impact that sea trout had on you, it's extraordinary on a wider range, isn't it? The impact that has on your life.
It is. And you think that's such a tiny, in a macro level, it's such a tiny event. I mean, kid catching small sea trout, so what? But it dragged me into a life of fly fishing, I suppose, fishing for anything, but basically fly fishing, which has just brought the most amazing amount of pleasure and travels to all sorts of far-flung parts of the world for, as I said, 40, 50 years. And that's, I think that's pretty special. And yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've driven across bridges and almost driven into them because I can't help peering over the parapet. They always make parapets too high, so you can't really see the river, which is, either they should make them so high there is no river to see, or so low that you can actually see the river. But they have this sort of very unhappy medium where you can just about see the river, but you really can't concentrate on the road, which is not great.
I think that's one of the few arguments for 4x4s in this environment, isn't it?
Just about the only one. Yes, you're high enough, I guess, to see.
We're going to talk, move on to the book at some stage or shortly, but I wanted to know when that started, and I'm guessing it became on the verge, if not of an obsessional pastime or an important pastime. Were you journaling these experiences then?
Not really. What happened was I like to write. So at school, I'd win something stupid like the English prize or the history essay prize or whatever. So I've always been good at writing. So I love to write. It's just something I do. It comes naturally, and I just enjoy doing it. So what I did was, I guess, in the 90s, or actually no, the 80s, I would write the odd article for magazines. But after a while, I thought, with all due respect to, I might say not fly culture, but the more mundane fishing magazines, they're mainly how do you catch fish, what do you do, that kind of stuff. And I got a bit bored because I don't pretend to know how to catch fish. I'm certainly not going to be lecturing others on how to catch fish. It's really not what I'm able to do. So I thought, this is dull. So I just started writing for fun. And I had a friend at the time called Bruce Anderson, who sadly is now gone, but he was a fishing journalist and writer in Scotland and did a lot of environmental work against fish farming. And I was talking to him, and he'd written several books and wrote in the newspapers every week. And he said to me, you're writing a book. I said, no, don't be silly. I'm just writing magazine articles the way I would like to write them, without an editor telling me that, it's only got to be 1 page long and it's got to be all about how to catch a trout. And I said, that's not what gets me going. So I said, I'm writing the kind of articles I'd like to write. And he said, well, you're writing a book. So I then thought, oh, it's an odd idea. I'm writing a book. And at the time in Devon, it was, even to me, it was becoming obvious that there were less and less fish. And I thought, I'd like to do something to help. And at that stage, I guess I met Ori Vigfusson, who I'm sure we'll talk about later. And I thought I'd like to generate some income, especially for the North Atlantic Salmon Fund, which at the time was doing fantastic work buying off the nets. Because, back in the 90s, there were salmon nets on just about every salmon river estuary in Scotland, England, Ireland, Wales, etc. And then, whatever you think about commercial farming, there were less and less salmon, and the commercial fishing was taking an awful lot of them. So something had to be done if the species wasn't going to become extinct. So I thought, well, what can I do? And I was naive, so I spoke to fishing lodges. I spoke to some of the magazines and said, couldn't you just increase your price by some tiny amount and give it to these charities? Because let's face it, if there are no salmon in your rivers, your fishing lodge or your magazine will have nothing to write about, and you won't have any guests and you won't make any money and blah, blah, blah. But, commercial interests are complicated, and I was naive and that wasn't going to work. So eventually I thought, you know what, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to publish the book myself, and I'm going to give all the money to the North Atlantic Salmon Fund. And that, I guess, was in the late 90s. And that's where I started. So it's, I everywhere I go fishing, yes, I nowadays, well, the last 20 plus years, I always have a notepad. So I scribble stuff all over the place. I'm sitting in a car sometimes going to a river in Argentina, which, might take a while. And I see, I don't know, some amazing mountain structure or birds or flowers or something happens. I'll scribble notes down, and then writing it is just, it's kind of what I do. So it's not work. In fact, it's the antithesis of work. It's probably another reason I do it. So I've just taken notes and written stuff for as long as I can remember, really.
And that's a really lovely story. And I really love what you've done for the salmon. And, we're going to talk about your latest book, but you said you started writing in the 90s. This is now your 7th, isn't it?
Yes, somehow it is, which is odd. But as I say, because, people ask what you do, and I say, I work in this or that, but I never ever say I write, because I don't really think I'm a writer, but it's my pastime and I guess my passion. And yeah, so somewhere along the line, I seem to have written 7 books. And whether there'll be an 8th or not, I'm not sure, because I'm not a writer and I don't make 1 penny out of it. I only write when I want to, or if you like, when I have to, because I've got something in my head, because something interesting happened or something emotional or something funny. and I want to put it on paper. So that's when I write. I don't have to. I'm lucky. I don't have to sit down and say, "Oh gosh, my editor wants 100 pages by the end of the month," or I don't get a paycheck. I just sit down and say, "Well, if I got something to write, I'll write it." But I'm not going to write for the sake of writing. But yeah, so somehow I produced 7 books along the way.
Well, whereas I'm standing or sitting while we're talking, that qualifies you as a writer in my book, literally. And obviously you've contributed, I think, 2 so far, and I'm sitting on another one of yours that we're going to, so you're definitely a writer in my book. And I think that's a really interesting angle and something that I've tacked before with creative people. And something you said there was really interesting to me, when something emotional or happy or whatever it is. And do you find those peaks and troughs in emotion actually help that creative process for you? Rather than being very happy or a little low, they're the most creative points rather than a steady, even keel. Do you find that yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely spot on. It's got to move you. And it can be anything. Yes, of course, it can be losing a big fish, or, fun enough, to a lesser extent, catching one. I think the emotion is much stronger when you lose one than when you catch one. But that can do it. But actually, there's a load of other stuff that can. Sometimes, especially in Argentina and Patagonia, you're driving back after a day's fishing and you're a bit tired and it's been a beautiful day. And you get these unbelievable sunsets over the Andes. And they're just astonishingly beautiful. And they're moving. And I look at them, and I'm sitting in the car chatting to my friend, my fishing guide, and I'm looking at this, and the way I deal with it is I'm actually in my head trying to write it down. And for some reason, that's what I do. If I see something that emotionally really moves me, I will go through it and think, well, how would I describe that on paper? And I write it in my head, and then when I get back to fishing lodge, I grab my notebook and I scribble a few things down, and that's how I do it. But it needs, as you say, it needs to be something that really is a strong emotion, and then it's almost as if I have to write it down. It's not I'm sitting there thinking, well, is there anything I can write? It's in my head, it's bubbling up, and I want to get it on paper.
Yeah. My biggest fear is remembering it when it's bubbling away in my head. That's the hardest part of the exercise. But I find also that I don't write for our magazine simply because I don't want people to think that we haven't got any content to put in there. So I use Facebook as an output for that. And things that I've noticed recently is that if it's been a wonderful day, the amount of words I use are fewer, in the sense of there's a couple of lovely days I've had recently where I've just written it, empty 303, bacon rolls, rising grayling, and just writing that. And it said everything I wanted to say. Yet perhaps when you're not feeling so great, I can be much more descriptive. It's something I analyze probably a little bit too much, but I wonder if you've noticed similar sort of things that, like you say, there's an emotive thing like a beautiful sunset, which is obviously a happy experience, yet something that triggers a downward moment in your life that whatever it may be, creatively works fabulously well. Have you found that those peaks and troughs, the lower ones have been more creative, or the higher ones? Which do you find?
I think it's a very interesting question. And by the way, I think I've seen some of your writing on Instagram, which I did enjoy a lot. But yeah, I think I've always, as a reader, I've always preferred tragedy to comedy. I guess that's just the way I'm set. And as I said, I find losing a fish I can write about, hopefully, quite well. Catching a big fish, yeah, it's great. It's very nice. It's lovely, and you remember it. But I don't remember it as much. The jolt, the lightning flash of emotion is much stronger when that big thing that's been towing you around for half an hour comes free. And I find that's probably, I don't know, but it's probably when I write better than saying, wow, this was fantastic. I caught this huge fish, or we caught loads of fish, or whatever. I think I agree with you. I think actually the really depressingly bad moments are actually easier to capture and more telling on paper than the happier ones.
I wonder if it's a subconscious thing as well, that you're sort of, if it is a good fish, like you say, that's been towing you around a little bit, that you're sort of mentally preparing yourself for that loss. So it's sort of subconsciously manifesting itself because I guess you talk about, I lost a fish, but often when you say, I lost a fish, you will then describe, don't you, to a friend or whoever it is later in the day or whatever, you describe that with much more detail because you haven't got anything to show somebody as a result of that fish that you landed. Do you think it's that perhaps?
I think that's it. And I think there's probably, without trying to get sort of pseudo-psychological, there's probably some sort of catharsis in that by talking about it, you're helping get over I know it sounds silly, the pain of losing a fish. And you think, well, in the grander scheme of things, losing a fish really doesn't matter. But it to us fishermen, it does. And I think, as you say, you do remember it much better. If you ask me about, the few big fish I've caught, and you asked me to describe it, I couldn't really tell you very much. I don't know why. Maybe it's because when you catch it, then there's a flood of emotion and you take the picture and put it back, and that's great. And then it's as if you've ticked the box and it's gone. Whereas when I've lost it, I'll be sitting there thinking, what did I do wrong? I remember that happening. Should I have done this? Should I have done that? And you sort of fix it in your memory. It's very bizarre. I mean, I can remember losing big fish from 20 years ago as if it was yesterday, whereas the fish I caught, 3 days later, I couldn't tell you anything except, I got a picture of it. And I think probably that's what makes the writing hopefully more powerful, because it's got more emotional content than the one you actually catch.
Yeah. I like delving into understanding ourselves as anglers and how we react to situations. And I think you're exactly right that, the fish that you caught, you've got a picture of it, so you know it's there. You don't have to remember it. Whereas you remember, and there's so many I remember along the lines that I think about, and I can know exactly where I was standing, what I was doing, what happened. Whereas a lot of those trout, even that I've posted recently, I can't remember a great deal about them. Yeah, it's a fascinating rabbit hole or wormhole to go down that I find really interesting. Now, I'm going to ask you to read a little bit of a section of your book a little bit later, but I really wanted to, if listeners haven't read your articles in Fly Culture, anywhere else, or your books, how would you describe your style of writing to listeners?
So I like words, which may sound a very banal thing for a so-called writer to say, but I like language and I like words. So I love reading, the likes of Lord Grey, Harry Plunkett Green, Skews, J.W. Hills, because they wrote beautiful English. So I'm not claiming to write beautiful English, but I would like to think that I write longhand English, which is descriptive, which carries emotion. So I'm not at all the sort of person. I'm not the slightest bit interested in talking about how many fish I caught. That seems of no interest to anybody. I'm not the slightest bit interested in saying, look at me, I caught this, 100 pounds, something or other, or that I used a unbelievably clever technical fly and some obscure technique with a sort of 50-foot leader. All of that is beyond me, and it doesn't interest me. So what I try to do when I write is to capture the beauty of a place, some of the history and the background and the culture and the folklore, the people, and above all, I guess the emotion of it, and sometimes the humor and sometimes the happiness and sometimes, as you said, the sadness. So I'm really trying to capture the fun and the emotion and the place. The fact that you may or may not, or I may or may not catch a fish, that's really irrelevant. It's almost just an excuse to write about the moment and the place. So that's what I'm trying to do.
And that comes across perfectly. And that, I guess, from my point of view, it was a slightly loaded question, because I can almost see that nod in your writing to that classic prose, and that comes across very, very strongly in there. And I think that's probably why I enjoy publishing your pieces, because it's not about the size, it's not about the numbers, it's not about the technique. It is about that bigger picture, and that's why I sort of enjoy reading your writing so much. So it's fascinating to get an insight into that. So for our listeners, then we've sort of learnt a little bit about you as an angler, your style. What is Sketches with a Fly Rod? How would you describe that as a book to listeners?
It's really a book of, as the title I guess suggests, of sketches. So past books, I always wanted to have a theme. So I wrote one about Iceland, I wrote one about Argentina, and I wrote one about fishing, but through the eyes of, as you said, the past great authors and fishermen. So there was always some historical research that went behind it. This book, I thought, well, actually, I don't have a theme to write about. So what I'd like to do is just take some stories. So really, it's a collection of stories that are in, the chalk streams, Argentina fishing for trout, Iceland fishing for salmon or trout. There's even, I think, a chapter on fishing for salmon in Russia, which obviously isn't going to happen for a long time. There's bits from the United States. There's a bit in the Caribbean at my hopeless efforts to catch bonefish and tarpon. So it's just a bunch of stories from wherever I've been, written, as we just discussed, with a view to, here's something that happened in a beautiful place, or with some lovely people, or some interesting people, or something funny, and just trying to capture the place and capture the moment. And it's just lots of short stories from around the world.
And it does that. It captures them beautifully. Like you say, there's a mixture of chalk stream stuff. One that made me smile was your first trip to Scotland for salmon. And you sort of touched on that a little bit. And I said that you're sort of incredibly self-deprecating about your angling prowess. And I'm sure that isn't entirely true, given our conversation that we talked about the Bourne Rivulet as well. But and you talked about the how-to thing and not wanting to go down that route and write stuff about that. Is that a mechanism not to put yourself into that position as the role of, and I'm using inverted commas, expert, so that you don't have to go down that how-to route, that it allows you to explore that much wider sphere that you're describing?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You waxed the nail slap on the head. I'm really not I think I'm probably a pretty good fly fisherman, but I'm really not a good caster, which is, I think, what you alluded to in the first Scottish chapter, when I was trying dismally to spey cast, having never had a lesson, and have some miserable gilly who had the most beautiful spey cast, but really couldn't be bothered to teach a kid how to do it. So it was a disaster, and actually I still have a sort of hang up about it even now. When I go to the spey and I walk out, I'm always actually quite scared when the gilly says, just pop in there and have a cast, and I think, oh God, please go away, and he won't go away, and he's standing there watching him. And I always excuse myself and say, look, I'm sorry, but you've got to understand, I have caught a lot of salmon, but I really am a hopeless spey caster. But no, you're absolutely right. I really don't want to pretend to tell people how to catch fish, because I honestly don't think I know anything particularly special. The guides know 100 times more than I do. I'm hopefully quite competent in executing it because I listen to what they say, and I fished a lot and I've got lots of experience. But I'm not trying to tell people how to do it, and that's not why I fish. And I find it, to be honest, when I read, that sort of more mundane articles, not fly culture, I might add, but the more mundane stuff you get in some of the mainstream press, I find them a bit dull. I'm not interested. I'm really not interested in the latest technique or the latest tiny variant of a fly, or the fact that you caught, 25 trout in a day. That's great. Good for you. But that's not what I'm trying to write about. So yeah, I'm very keen. And to loop back to a comment you made earlier about whether we like the highs or the lows, I'm very keen not to come across as, frankly, oh God, look at that rich guy, just flies to all these exotic destinations and catches all these big fish. There are a number of those around, and you see them in the press. I really don't want to be one of these people. That's not what I'm trying to do. And that, I think, Pete, is one of the reasons I prefer talking about fish I lost than fish I caught, because I don't want to come across as, look at me, I'm a hero. I've caught all these big fish, which I haven't, by the way. But that's not at all what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to capture the pleasure and the emotion of the fishing, not I'm a hero because I know how to catch fish and I catch more than you do.
Yeah, nicely put. And I'm with you. And I think that landscape is changing a little bit. And I know, when you're a little bit younger, that means something. So I kind of get that. But and so many times we talk about the stages of a fly angler and everything else. Yeah. But I think through our little magazine and chats like this, I try really hard to, I love, it's wonderful seeing on social media somebody's had a wonderful day, but it's everything else that I'm really, really interested in. And where were they fishing? What did the river look like? What did, that's the sort of stuff I love, the bigger picture of it, which I think you catch perfectly in your book, certainly. And would it be fair to say you have a small love affair with South America?
As long as you say South America, yes. Yeah. Yes, I think it's all right. My wife's downstairs. No, I think I do. I especially Argentina. I think it's just a fabulous country. I love the people. I think politics is tragic, but Patagonia is just so beautiful. The moment you get off the plane, and the light, you walk down those steps and the light floods in from the Andes. It's astonishing. And I think there's a sort of emotional charge I get actually just from being there, because it's just relatively unspoiled, utterly beautiful. I find the people lovely. And there's a lot of very interesting history and culture. So yeah, I intend to keep going there, as long as I can A, afford it, and B, physically get there.
Fantastic. And how you've obviously described it in your articles, you describe it in the book and everything else, and which sounds a stunning place to go catch some fish. Were trout introduced there in a similar sort of way as the sea trout in Tierra del Fuego and places like that? Is it a similar sort of an outpost? Yeah.
It was all the same deal. The sea trout were from a chap called John Goodall, who ran the one of the biggest estancias cattle ranches down on Tierra del Fuego, and he brought them in for his own amusement because he had nothing to catch but the local perch, which were they're not the same as European perch. They're much uglier and they're not really very interesting. So he brought in a few trout. And the rest is history, because they all vanished, of course. And then a couple of years later, he said, "This is odd. Somebody's catching these big sort of silvery trout. What can they be?" And yes, they flooded Patagonia with all sorts of fish. I mean, bizarre stuff. They put burbot, which I think is a freshwater cod, into rivers which vanished. They put Pacific salmon and steelhead into east-flowing southern hemisphere Atlantic rivers. So they all vanished except one river, which is the Santa Cruz, where they'd got rainbow trout from the McCloud River in California. And that's, I think, the only natural wild east-running, i.e. Atlantic-run southern hemisphere. I'm going to call them Pacific salmon, but of course they're going to the Atlantic. And yeah, they put in brown trout, rainbows, brook trout. Landlocked salmon is a great story. The landlocked salmon were being taken down from a hatchery, and the chap who was looking after them, the fishery scientist, noticed that the eggs were beginning to hatch, and he said, we need to do something here. And the local native Indians, the Araucanians, who were fairly warlike, So travel was very slow, and it was quite dangerous and quite difficult. And he noticed that, the ova were beginning to get eyes and then hatch. So he built a little sort of dam on a tributary just by the road and chucked him in there, thinking, well, they're all going to die in my horse and cart, so I'll just put them in some running water. And he stayed there for a few days trying to make sure there was a fresh flow of water over them. And that basically there was a tiny tributary around the Trefoil River. And I don't know, 20 years later, a famous author, fisherman called Ernie Schweibert was catching world record landlocked salmon from Maine originally in Argentina, purely because of a fisheries scientist who realized the eggs were beginning to hatch and chucked them into a tributary next to the road. So, yeah, there's a lot of fantastic stories about how these fish got there.
That is absolutely extraordinary. And I was going to we're going to listen to you read a section of the book very shortly, but that again segues beautifully, because I was going to ask you a little bit about salmon, and everything that you've done via your books has been to help populations of wild fish. Does that make you feel that the decline that we're going through at the moment, for so many reasons, do you think that it is reversible, or have we gone too far? Are we past that tipping point? What, in your opinion, where do you think we're actually sitting right now?
I would prefer to be. I'd really prefer to be an optimist, and the reason I say that is not because I'm optimistic about humans, because I'm not particularly. I think we will continue to do the wrong thing because it makes money for certain people. But I do think nature is phenomenally resourceful and resilient. And I think the human efforts will tag along too slowly, too late. But I just hope that nature, with a little help, not enough, but a little help from us, will keep going. I don't think the Atlantic salmon, for instance, Ori Vigfusson always, his goal was a natural abundance, as used to be. I don't think we're ever going to get back to the natural abundance that existed before. But I do think and hope, obviously, that we will stop them from extinction. So I retain some optimism, because I think if I didn't retain any optimism, there'd be no point fishing for them, and there'd be no point trying to help charities that are trying to save them. So I think, there has to be some optimism that nature, with a little help from us, albeit not enough, will struggle through.
Yeah, that's my hope. And I was sitting thinking while you were talking about that if the question I was going to ask you was, if they said you've got to stop fishing for 2 years to help the run, would you do it? But the impact that anglers have on the run is probably so small that it's not going to make any real difference anyway, is it?
I think the answer to both questions is yes. If somebody told me that I couldn't, the run is now way below, and I hate this word, but this is the proper use of it, sustainability. So we need to just stop any threats. Yeah, sure, I'd stop fishing. But as you say, I suspect it wouldn't make any difference, because the problem's not, it's not fishermen, whatever we call ourselves, sport fishermen, pleasure fishermen. It's not us who are causing the decline. The declines are, I think, for the Atlantic salmon, they're on a much more macro level, and an awful lot of it's obviously happening out at sea, and that is extraordinarily difficult to understand and B, control, because obviously it crosses multiple frontiers and boundaries and countries, etc. So I don't think we achieve anything, and in many ways, I think fishermen or fisherwomen are, taking fishers off the river actually just means possibly that the last few fish that are there will be poached to extinction very quickly. So there's a flip side, that even if fishers aren't fishing, they're actually there, and by physically being there and looking after the rivers, they at least control poaching. They hopefully can stop pollution, etc., etc. So I think if we get to the level where we have to close rivers to fishing, which I know has happened, it's almost too late.
Mm. Yeah, no, it's a very valid point. It suddenly dawned on me that it just didn't make sense to do that because, as you say, there are so many other obstacles that salmon in particular have to deal with. Towards the end of the book, and you've mentioned him a couple of times now, you pay tribute to Ori Vigvason, and I'm guessing he was a big influence in your life, was he?
Yeah, as I said, I'm probably a bit cynical, so I don't generally have heroes. I would honestly say he was a hero. He was an extremely kind and generous man, extraordinarily driven and charming. So Ori, he was fairly small chap, and he'd walk into a room, and he'd have the room in his hand. And I guess that's why he was so successful, because he would talk to major politicians, leaders of countries, and he didn't care. And he had his mission, which was to save the Atlantic salmon, to bring back an abundance. He put an awful lot of his own money, and he'd made quite a lot of money in business in Iceland. He put huge amounts of his own money in. He jet-setted around the world, trying to get people to see sense and do the decent thing, completely selflessly. And he was a man who just wouldn't give up. He was the proverbial dog with a bone. He would not give up until you agreed. And the point was, he didn't batter you into submission like modern politicians. He just talked sense and charmed you. And eventually you said, you know what? This man's right. We need to do what he's trying to do. And his death was awful. It was too early, and he's hugely missed. But the work he did, I think, was phenomenal. I mean, it was also terribly practical. He bought off nets. He found the netsmen, the people who'd been making a living out of it, absolutely honestly and decently. Instead of just saying you're the bad people and we rich salmon fishermen are the good people, so we want more salmon, so you've got to stop doing the work that your family's done for 100 years. He said, no, there's a problem with the stock. We all need to look after the stock. You need a job. I'm going to find you something better to do. You can look after your family. You can pay the mortgage, and the salmon will be left alive. So all those fish that would have ended up dead, in Billingsgate Market are still in the river. He saved tens of millions of salmon. So it's absolutely concrete what he did. It's not some obscure science. It's absolutely concrete. And he was a real force. He was just an extraordinary man.
Yeah, and like you say, sadly missed. And his legacy is still very strongly intact, isn't it, within the fishing community?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we talked about the book, and you talk in there about trout, salmon, bonefish. Is there a favourite fish that you personally love to chase, or is it all good as far as you're concerned?
It is all good. I mean, I would fish in the bathtub for a fish if there was one there, probably, but we can't all fish all the time everywhere. So if somebody said, what are you going to fish for? You're on your desert island. I'd probably pick a brown trout. I'm not terribly exotic in terms of fishing. So, there's 100 exotic species I'd like to catch, never have, but it doesn't really worry me. The brown trout, I find, as we said earlier, can be fish's brains the size of a pea. So let's not exaggerate. They're not hugely intelligent, but they have a very powerful sense of instinct. And I think they're very spooky. So, brown trout scientifically is more difficult or more grumpy and difficult to catch than a rainbow, which is more difficult than a cutthroat or a brookie. And I think they're beautiful fish. And what I like about brown trout is that a limestone trout from Durness on the northwest coast of Scotland is silver and apricot finned. A corrib trout from the limestone lochs in the west of Ireland is butty yellow with black spots. Chalk stream trout covers in red spots and got little red flashes on its adipose fins. An Argentine or an Icelandic trout. Icelandic trout can almost have a blue sheen and they have a big blue spot behind their gill plate, as does Argentine trout. A peaty loch trout in Scotland is dark and burnished and almost black, and so the colour scheme is ever changing, which I find fascinating, and I just find them fun to catch. And there, as I said before, there are moments I can't catch them. Even though I know they're sitting there, sometimes I can see them and I can't catch them. I think that's probably why I like them so much.
And that was a beautiful argument for trout anglers as well. The beauty of all the fish, no matter where you are, they're all absolutely stunning, aren't they?
I mean, they really are. And often they're in pretty places. And as I said, I would fish in the bathtub. But, if somebody can give me a beautiful fish in a beautiful place, obviously it's nicer.
Yeah, absolutely. You are a well-travelled angler. Is there a place that you haven't visited that you would love to visit?
Yes. New Zealand, I guess, is the obvious one. Everybody tells me that I've got to get to New Zealand. I've seen, 1,000 things on Instagram and YouTube, etc. The scenery looks phenomenal. The trout obviously are amazing. And again, it fits right into that slot of not many fish, difficult to catch, big, ultra spooky. And if you mess it up, you mess it up. And I'd love to do that. So I think that's probably the one place on my bucket list. I mean, I'd like to go to Canada and fish some of the salmon rivers there. But, I've been lucky. I've fished some great salmon rivers. So it would be a bit more of the same. I think New Zealand trout, from what I've seen, is probably pretty much unique. I mean, I think the only place that would get anywhere near it maybe is Patagonia. You could argue that parts of the United States did, but I think the reason I like Patagonia is, to me, I love fishing in Montana. I fished in Montana years ago, but I think Patagonia is probably what Montana was like in, the 1950s. Just way fewer people. And New Zealand, obviously, you're taking it to the extreme. There's even less people. To me, it seems like the last unspoilt wilderness destination that's readily accessible.
Yeah, fair comment and fair choice as well. Now, so as I've said, we've got a sense of you as a person, as an angler, as a writer. I thought it would be really cool for people to have a listen from you, perhaps reading a very short section of the book. Would that be okay with you?
That would be absolutely, yeah, I'd love to do that. It's great, and I've never actually read anything from any of my books, bizarrely. But I can have a go. Hopefully I can read my own writing. Don't worry, I mean, I don't mean handwriting. This is actually a book. Luckily, I have one copy. I only have one copy here, but I have one copy. So why don't we go to Argentina? Because that's a good segue. And just to set this in context, I'll just read a couple of short paragraphs. We're about 5 miles from the Chilean border. We're in Argentina. We're in the foothills of the Andes on a high plain, surrounded by, obviously, the mountains. There's a sort of swampy, lakey bit full of, believe it or not, flamingos. Then the river splits into a bunch of channels and cuts through water meadows, which look, in many ways, like an English chalk stream. And they have these beautiful trout. So if I take up the story very quickly here, I've hooked this thing, and it's careering around the river, and this is what I had to say. As I fiddled with the drag again, still running to keep up, we spotted, 30 yards away in the same indentation in the bank where that fish had leaped ashore, a dark brown shape. It was triangular, a fin, a caudal fin, a fish's tail. Small head, shoulders like an American footballer, a deep belly of glowing bronze, an old brown trout with the physique of a humpbacked salmon. It was a tango I will never forget. Returning home in the evening through the national park, we saw a hideous scar across the face of the mountains, blackened tree trunks reaching starkly out of a grey and ashen earth. Thousands of acres lay barren from at least 4 different fires. The last of them started at Nanty Fall just after we had left. Curls of smoke still rose from clefts in the hillsides, and the air was acrid with the smell of charred wood, bitter to the taste. The fire had crossed the road but was now controlled, and a pair of suspects held in custody, being interrogated about their mindless incendiary folly. I felt the warm glow of a long day in the wind and sun, my elbows stiff from the effort of trying to punch a line to somewhere and leave a fish away from the ubiquitous weed. But the exhilaration of such a bounty of trout was tinged with an angry sadness. In front of us, framing the whole valley, a perfect rainbow hooped across, drops of rain shining on the windscreen, the mirror image of a double rainbow faintly glimmering over the natural greenery that had been spared.
Lovely.
So that was, thank you. That was after some arson in the national park, which burnt down acres and acres and acres of this beautiful forest. It was dreadful.
And that's the lovely thing again about what we talked about the writing there, that it was obviously a wonderful fish that you'd hooked, but we don't know the full story. It wasn't revolving around the fish. It was more about, what had gone on what you'd seen on the way home sort of thing. And that's what I really love about the writing and the book, that the fish are the theme, but they're not always the star. Is that fair to say?
No, I mean, thank you, Pete. That's it's very kind of you to say that, and it's really nice to hear it, because you're spot on. That's exactly that's the point. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm not interested in look at me. I caught this big trout, and here's a picture of me with this enormous trout grinning. Blah blah blah. That's just not interesting. The trout, there was quite a story to catching it, which is in the book because it's fun what it did. It ran under a tree and blah, blah, blah. So it was exciting. And there's a story there. And there's a bit of humor about another trout that we caught in the same place and actually jumped ashore on the far side of the river. So there is a story there. But to me, the point is the emotion of catching this absolute beauty of a fish in this incredible arena of the Andes with, as I said, flamingos over my shoulder. And then the stark reality of driving home down from the mountains, down through the foothills, which are covered in blackened, burnt trees, because, some moron of a human being, for whatever reason, because they've got a personal grudge against something or someone, had lit a fire. And this wasn't just some idiot, throwing aside a cigarette or holding a campfire. This was arson. And I think that's what I was. That's really what I was trying to capture, as you say. Not the look at me with the fish, but the whole atmosphere of the day.
Yeah, you capture it absolutely perfectly. And for listeners, if you are unable, we can't go catch some trout at the moment. But if you want to read about these sorts of moments, about trout, grayling, salmon, and in far-flung places, then I think you're going to enjoy sketches with a fly rod. Adrian, if people want to buy a copy and get hold of a copy, where do they find it?
They find it on the Medlar Press, MEDLAR, on the Medlar Press website. It's only available on the website. You won't find it on Amazon, believe it or not. You won't really find it in the bookshops. There's you may think that's weird. Medlar is a small independent bookseller, publisher. They publish lovely books. It's a family-run business. They do all the work. As I said, I have the fun writing the book. They actually put it together. And all the royalties go to charity. So all the money goes to North Atlantic Salmon Fund and the Wild Trout Trust. And frankly, if you put your book on, what should we call it, the more commercial outlets for sales, they will rape and pillage all the money. So effectively, there's nothing left. So, we all agreed we wanted to give, I wanted to give all my royalties to charity. And the best way to do that is to cut down everybody else, taking the money out of the book. So the only place you can get it is from the Medlar Press website. And as I said, all the royalties go to charity. And hopefully you'll enjoy the book and you will be doing a good thing.
Well, that's it's hard to argue against that, isn't it? It's great to read and you're doing some good for it. So I hope, if you've read Fly Culture, you'll know a little bit more about Adrian's writing as well. So you'll get a sense of that and from listening to him speak. So I hope you'll consider, again, as I always say on these things, Adrian's not paid to be on here or anything else. I wanted him to be on here because I'm a fan of his writing. I'm a fan of what he's doing with these books as well. And I think things like this and championing small publishing houses as well should be done as well, because it's a hard business to be in against these massive companies, that it's really important to try and support them if we can. So I hope this has given you a good look literally inside Sketches with a Fly Rod. And I hope you've enjoyed listening to this podcast. I've certainly enjoyed talking to Adrian today. Adrian, it's been wonderful talking with you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. And perhaps if you do find yourself down in Devon, you sound exactly the sort of angler I would love to fish with. If you find yourself down this way, I'd love to take you on my beloved river tour.
Thank you so much, Pete. And I promise you, you, as they say, you have a date.
Fantastic. Adrian, thank you so much for being a guest on the Fly Culture podcast today.
Thanks.
Everyone, this has been another episode of the Fly Culture podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this one as much as me. As ever, there will be plenty more down the line. If you are enjoying them, perhaps you will take the time to consider subscribing and perhaps leave us a nice review as well. That allows us to share the podcast with a wider fishing population. But thank you so much for listening to the Fly Culture podcast.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.